today's talk, much of it's going to focus on the Catawba Nation and their history. But first, I think it's important to situate the discussion, right? Figure out, understand who Native people are and their relationship to the United States. So the story of the Catawba is part of a larger story. So initially, Native people lived in all parts of this country. This is an older map showing from the East Coast to the West Coast. There were tribes in every single part of the country. Now, one of the things you'll notice about these types of maps is that obviously it changes over time, but the eastern part is very different than the western part of this country. So the history of eastern tribes is similar in some ways, but it's also very different from tribes that live out west. See here, this is a picture of the various different reservations. And you look at the East Coast, and you can't even see any of them. It's not that they're not here, but the landmass and the loss of land is very different. The history is very different here. So we're going to focus a lot today on the Catawba and the difference with Eastern tribes, particularly in the Southeast, and what it means to be Native here. So some of the difference comes from the fact that Eastern tribes had much longer contact with the European colonizers and then with the US government. It started earlier, it's lasted longer. And then some of it's also removal. So one of the things in this slide where you see the loss of land and the tribes moving onto reservations, a lot of the tribes in the East, you've heard about the Trail of Tears, right? It's primarily the Cherokee, but there are other tribes as well that are forcibly removed from the Southeast to the Oklahoma Territory. But one of the questions I think a lot of people have is, did everyone leave? Right? What about the tribes that stayed? Presumably some people stayed. Obviously, we've got the Catawba Nation we're going to talk about. They stayed here. So I think one of the first questions that I want to ask you, Jeff, is about this difference. Right? What's it like for Southeastern tribes in the 18th and 19th centuries? What's their relationship with the government, with the settlers? Why are they here? Why didn't they move? And how does that impact a lot of your relations still today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when you think about Southeastern tribes during that time frame, and specifically for Catawba, it was all about survival. Before contact, we numbered tens of thousands, and then through disease and loss of land, the numbers start dwindling down. Specifically for Catawba, you see as numbers start dwindling down, we actually formed a confederacy with other tribes in the same language family. So modern day Catawba, we often call it the Catawba Confederacy, but it's actually made up of Shira, of Catawba, original Catawba, of many other Siouan-based speaking tribes that clan together for survival, which really isn't different than the rest of Native history pre-contact. A tribe and a nation really was a family that came together and stayed together to support each other and to survive. So as we enter into the contact era, they do the same. And as that time moves on, as Professor Zug is referencing, eventually we hit the era where the nation is looking at removal. They identify lands that they want, and they remove, in many cases forcibly remove, Native people out to Oklahoma through the Trail of Tears. For many of the Southeastern tribes, we remain here today for various reasons. So for our friends Cherokee, many of you may know, but some may not, that there's the Eastern Band of Cherokee, which are located in the mountains, but there are two other Cherokee nations in Oklahoma. So those who remained hid in the mountains and tried to escape the Trail of Tears. For Catawba, we are in South Carolina simply because as the leadership of South Carolina during that era looked around and they said their population is dwindling, they're almost extinct. And they didn't want to put forward the state resources, the money that the state would have to put forward to help remove us. So rather than put forth those resources, they viewed it as, sometimes we refer to it as states in the country looking at it as an Indian problem, because in many ways they viewed it that way. There was land here and they wanted it. So they dealt with their Indian problem by saying, we don't have to remove them. They're simply going to go extinct because of disease and, breaking up their society as it was already happening. And that's really affected the entire relationship, the entire arc of the relationship between Catawba and the state of South Carolina, state of North Carolina, up until modern day. And as we go through the history of Catawba, you see times when land is taken through various means, sometimes through illegal treaties, sometimes through other means. And even as we regain and start rebuilding, there's restrictions. There's a little bit of misunderstanding and a little bit of, frankly, I think just being scared of what does it mean to have a sovereign inside your borders as a state. How do we deal with that? And that shows up in a lot of our legal history with the state of South Carolina. That fortunately I think is improving today, but it's been a long, long time to get there.
So you mentioned that Catawba are here basically because it was cheaper than removing them. Mm-hmm. So that sounds like a lot of government history there in general. But one of the things that happens, right, is you're not alone. Mm-hmm. That there are other groups that also manage to avoid removal and stay in South Carolina. So the map I have up here is the other American Indian groups that are in South Carolina. So the Catawba Nation is the only federally recognized tribe in South Carolina. There are also state-recognized tribes and non-recognized tribes. And I think a lot of people don't understand necessarily the difference between them. Mm-hmm. Why do you have federal recognition? What is state recognition? Who are the unrecognized tribes? Or are they different than you, or is it just a legal difference?
Yeah. So, and this is something that people come across a lot. So, for federally recognized tribes, what that really means is that there's a current relationship between the tribal nation and the federal government through some type of action throughout history. So, for some tribes, that comes across through a federal acknowledgement process, which is essentially a very long, decades-long process where you petition the federal government. It goes through the Department of Interior. They review a lot of things. Essentially, though, when you really boil it down, they're trying to determine, are you actually Indian in our eyes? Are you Native or not? And it's really just based off of the system that was put in place by Congress. So it wasn't something that Native people came up with and said, here's how we think that you can identify Native people and not non-Native people, but it was really a colonial system put in place. Other tribes are acknowledged through act of Congress. And so there's various means, but to be a state-recognized tribe, you're acknowledged by the state in which your population resides. To be federally recognized is a relationship with the federal government. And I think something that is sometimes lost or confused is that just because you're part of a state-recognized tribe doesn't mean that you are not actually Native or that you don't have actual ancestry. There's a lot of reasons. Each tribe has its own long history of why they are or are not federally recognized. And there's systems in place that allow certain tribes to be recognized and others not to be recognized. So there's a lot, and you have to really understand the history of each tribe to understand why they're in that status that they are now. And on top of that, you have tribes who are still aiming to get federal recognition. They've been state recognized for many years. They hope to be federally recognized, and they have to go through those very long processes. And when I say decades-long processes, I mean literal decades-long at times, petitions that have been sitting at the Department of Interior waiting for a decision for decades.
So what does it mean to be federally recognized? So we're saying that some tribes are federally recognized, and it's the government-to-government relationship. But why is it potentially better? Mm-hmm. Is it sometimes worse?
Most tribes view it as better because it comes along a lot with a trust relationship. So not only do you have a federal to tribe relationship where you have that direct contact, but then they also have a trust relationship where, because of the many things that tribes have lost, their lands, their culture, their languages, the federal government has accepted a trust responsibility to help provide citizens with necessities, with healthcare, with education, with many services. So when you become a federally recognized tribe, or when you are a federally recognized tribe, you qualify for a lot of federal grants that you wouldn't qualify for otherwise. So for a lot of tribes, that becomes very important. And I think most tribes do aspire to it. It does come with a lot of strings attached, though, right? We don't get to spend those funds just freely, and we don't even get to decide exactly what those programs are. The federal government says, here's a program that we think that you would need, that we think that you would like, so you can ask us for the money. And sometimes they're even competitive grants. However, a lot of times with federal recognition come a lot of difficulties. You see political battles for power of the tribe. Sometimes you even see banishment of tribal citizens within the tribe. And there are difficulties that come along with that at times for certain tribes. Most tribes, though, however, a lot of times their aim is to do that because they want to be able to provide for their citizens just like any other government would. And federal recognition is the path to do that.
So we'll talk more about some of the rights that come with this recognition. Well, you mentioned that one of the ways that you would get federal recognition is literally by being recognized by the federal government. It can also be recognition by state governments. Sometimes just by regular people living in South Carolina calling someone an Indian. If you can prove your descent from them, that could be enough to prove recognition later. So part of the Catawba history is certainly relationships with the South Carolina government. And you've had no problems proving this relationship, in part because there's also a treaty.
Right.
So I wanted, this is a map of, we talked a little earlier about how the Catawba is a confederacy and the different tribes would come together. This was the trading route that was recognized. So there was an understanding with the South Carolina people, the South Carolina government, North Carolina recognized, had a relationship with the tribes. These are our maps of the original area where the Catawba and others lived. But then you get the Treaty of Nation Ford. So this is a treaty with the state of South Carolina. And it's interesting, in part because it's illegal. And the treaty takes place in 1840. And the fact that it's illegal doesn't really wind up having implications for non-native South Carolinians until 1970s. Maybe we'll start talking about that. But can you explain a little bit about the treaty and what it says about sovereignty first? Mm-hmm. Right? The fact that one enters into treaties is a recognition of sovereignty. But this is also a treaty with a state. Right. So can states enter into treaties? And I called this an illegal treaty. So what does that mean?
Yeah. So it's an illegal treaty because just like we're talking about, there's a relationship between the federal government and nation. That's the proper place for a treaty that's where the relationship resides. So I like to explain it to people. If we were to have a treaty with France right now, you wouldn't expect South Carolina to enter into a treaty with France. It's the U.S. government. And the way our nation was founded was with recognition of these nations, these tribal nations having a direct relationship with the federal government, not with the states within which they happen to reside. So with the Treaty of Nations Ford, you really have to go back and look at our treaty with the Crown. So prior to the founding of this country, we had a treaty with the Crown that identified 144,000 acres wherein we would reside. That was identified for us, and 144,000 acres sounds pretty good. That encompasses much of modern-day York County and a little bit of the panhandle of Lancaster County, if you're familiar with that. Something of interest that I always grew up knowing, but then later as I got older realized that others didn't know, is that the border between South Carolina and North Carolina was determined by our lands, our borders, not by the Carolinas ultimately decided, but it was drawn around that. So as they divided the Carolinas, they came across this 144,000 acre, what essentially is a modern day reservation. These were the lands that were given to us, and it was formed in a square. So when you look at the map and you see modern day York County along the border, it comes across in a perfect square. This was an almost perfect square. So when the Carolinas decided to divide, they went across that line and they kept us within the state of South Carolina. But as we had that 144,000 acre territory, eventually people determined they wanted that territory as well. It became valuable. It's close to a lot of large towns, Charleston up to Charlotte, trading paths and things like that. So South Carolina and the nation decide that they discuss transferring ownership of that to South Carolina. And what was presented was the idea that there would be lands provided for us, they would care for us, they would provide services for us. And it was both an illegal treaty because, again, that treaty would only be able to go through Congress, through the federal government. But then in addition to it, South Carolina never held up its end of the deal. It never actually provided those services. So Catawba lost those lands because of that. And a couple of things I think about tribal sovereignty that I think we take from that are that, one, tribes want to govern themselves. They know the best for themselves. They know how to take care of their people. And another one that I always find interesting in the part of this history is that during this time frame, Catawba was very different than the society of people settling here. So when we had leases and we start leasing this land, it comes through women. Our women were the stewards of our homelands. It was a matrilocal society, which means that it was focused on where the women resided and focused on women being empowered at the homelands. So it was confusing to people as we enter into treaties and other leases that it was women that were empowered to make those decisions. Men had a separate role that was very important and not seen as greater than or less than, but it was a confusing thing. And it really just hits back to tribal sovereignty, that we organize our society in that way because that was the society that made sense to us.
And part of the recognition of tribal sovereignty is the right of tribal nations to govern themselves, make their own laws, be ruled by their own government. But as you mentioned, when tribal societies were very different than the non-tribal societies surrounding them, that often created conflicts and they were seen as inferior. And it's reasons why tribal culture needed to be changed, destroyed, assimilated. So one of the things that happens with this treaty, right? You sign the treaty, you're supposed to get new lands. Right. It doesn't happen. So South Carolina gets your land, but not only are you not actually legally allowed to make this treaty because it's with the state and not with the federal government, but they also don't follow it. They never give them anything in exchange. So illegal treaty, and they also steal their lands. But I want to talk, before we get into the implications of this, I don't know if anyone here is from your county, but if you are, you may know about the lawsuit that eventually happened because of this treaty. But before we get to that, with tribal sovereignty, one of the misconceptions about tribal sovereignty is that it's bestowed on tribes by the federal government. And that's the wrong way of looking at it. Tribal sovereignty is inherent. It has been limited. So it was limited initially under the Doctrine of Discovery at the time of first contact, but one of the basic rules of federal Indian law is that what hasn't been taken away remains. So tribes have all of the attributes of sovereignty. The federal government can take them away, and they have. And they have taken away a lot of the attributes of sovereignty, sometimes all of them. But if they don't, and if they haven't, then everything is still there. So it's not the federal government giving rights to the tribe. The tribe has all of these rights and they can be taken away. But certainly the history with the Catawba Nation is many infringements on your sovereignty. And two of the ones that I mentioned in my notes to you earlier, and you sort of alluded to as well, we have the imposition of Western forms of government, and I know you're still grappling with the IRA Constitution, which you still have, and then also you were actually terminated.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about that history.
Yeah. So during the era of the Indian Reorganization Act, when you see federal policy of how to deal with their Indian problem, what do you do with these sovereigns within the nation? You see these swings back and forth of how to either assimilate them, how to work with them, what's the best way for the nation to form policy that will allow the federal government to have a consistent policy with all of these Native people across the country. And during the IRA era, they really saw that some of these tribes did not have a written constitution. They were used to a very clear form of government. And that didn't mean that we didn't have rules, we didn't have laws, we didn't have societal expectations, but we didn't have a written constitution the same way that they came to expect. And again, as they're dealing with lands and other things, they want to know that the person that they're dealing with has the authority to sign over to be the person who can make decisions on behalf of the tribe. And even that itself is kind of a foreign concept to some tribes. A lot of times it's a very collective decision rather than just one person. So what they did during this era is they went around and they had essentially what's a boilerplate constitution. Ours is about 4.5 pages long, and it's nearly identical to the constitutions of probably dozens of tribal nations. Some have amended their own constitutions, but it sets up a form of government that was easy and familiar for federal officials to deal with, so that they know here's the group who's elected. These are the elected officials. They can make the decisions, and unfortunately. Again, with tribal sovereignty, we had our own forms of government. We had the ability to make our own laws. We had things that were working. We didn't survive for generations and generations without any types of rules. But there was no match with our culture. They just came in and said, here's a form of government that works. And tribal nations still struggle with that today. We continue to operate under that constitution with very minor amendments only since it was given to us in the 30s. And it's still the way we make our decisions because it was the document that was given to us. And now for some people, it's even seen as traditional to us because it's been traditional as long as they have known and as long as their parents and sometimes grandparents have known. But that was not our indigenous, that was not our actual form of governance. And later, as we go on in the history of federal Indian policy, the United States starts saying, maybe this is not working out for them to have their own governments. Maybe really the best way to deal with these tribes is to terminate the tribe, meaning terminate that federal relationship between the federal government and tribal nations. So what they did at that time was they would go to tribes and say, do you know what would be great? Do you know what's better than having a reservation, which is essentially owned collectively? It's ownership, your own ownership. You own this piece of land. But what that meant was that the federal government no longer had any obligations to the tribe when they terminated them. They no longer had an obligation to provide services, healthcare, education, all of the services that had long been promised because you were a terminated tribe. And Catawba was one of many tribes that were terminated during this era. So when I say terminated, I mean we had a relationship with the federal government documented, very well documented. We had the Senate Indian Affairs Committee have a meeting in Rock Hill, South Carolina, which is very odd if you think about that happening today. But they came and they saw part of their responsibilities was to see the conditions of the tribe and to legislate and figure out what to do. So you had that history for many years. But when we got to the 50s and early 60s, that was part of the era, and the Catawba was identified by the federal government as a tribe that could be terminated. And what happens across the nation is you see these tribes realizing that, again, the benefits that were sold to them actually were not as great as they sounded. Private ownership of land is great, but actually the collective ownership was working just fine, and we've lost a lot about that. So tribes like ours start reorganizing and start working towards regaining that federal recognition, restoring that federal relationship with the tribe, because those benefits were owed to us and they really were still due to us.
Yeah, so 100 years after the governor's like, oh, the Catawba are disappearing. Then they decided, well, you're still here, but we've decided that we're going to make you disappear, right? And it's after termination. So termination didn't just happen to Catawba, as you mentioned. It happened to many, many tribes during the termination period. It was terrible, and it quickly became clear that it was terrible. So many tribes since then have been re-recognized. Now, with the Catawba, part of the re-recognition problem goes back to that illegal treaty that we were talking about. So I asked if anyone here was from your county, because if you have an illegal treaty that basically covers all of your county, what do you think that means to your title, to the land you think you own? Apparently, may not own it. How do people living in an area where they don't own their house feel? Scared, mad, upset. So what happens, right? Well, let me ask you this first.
Mhm.
The legal treaty happens in 1840. Why are these lawsuits finally getting brought in 1970s, 80s? It eventually gets decided in 1993. Why do you wait so long?
So it really comes down, we have lots of swings of federal policy happening. It's not like everything is going great, but what we have is we find the problem of we've been terminated, and our society has again changed. We've lost all of these services. We've lost everything, and what was sold to us actually didn't end up working out. So it really comes up because we're searching for a way to restore that federal relationship. And as I mentioned earlier, that can either happen through act of the executive branch, the Department of Interior, but that's a decades-long process, or it can happen by act of Congress. So the tribe quickly sees after termination that what was sold to us wasn't our reality. So it reorganizes itself. This again is in the backdrop, especially in the 70s, of the American Indian movement, where where tribes and tribal citizens are trying to reorganize and really focus in on what's been lost of our lands, of our culture, and we look for a way to restore that. We start petitioning our local representatives in Congress, and it falls on deaf ears. So with the help of the Native American Rights Fund, we identified this illegal treaty. Because it's an illegal treaty, we never really ceded that 144,000 acres legally. So we have an argument that we still hold title to it. So that really was the backdrop of focusing in on that treaty and focusing in on this as a path to show people that these lands still belong to us. We still have a claim to these lands, and is eventually what leads us to re-recognition.
Yes, they didn't want to ignore you for decades with
Yeah.
that land claim hanging over part of South Carolina. So when you had that clout, that legal clout, it helped with the re-recognition, which came with its own limitations as well. So one of the things that I was going to ask this later, but one of the things that people often wonder is about gaming, right? And for a long time, people wondered, maybe still, why is there not an Indian casino in South Carolina? Why is there not one on the Catawba Reservation? And again, it goes back to this treaty and then the re-recognition agreement.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think to kind of share what happens is we have been clamoring and saying, you need to restore our federal recognition. There was this illegal treaty. We have a valid claim here. And there's a lot of time in courts dealing with very weird property laws that probably only lawyers care about. But really what the end result of that is the courts say, yes, you may have a potential claim here, but you have to sue everybody who has land in that 144,000 acre territory in order to exert that, or to bring that claim. And with the help of the Native American Rights Foundation, Rights Fund, we actually do. We sue everybody who lives in basically most of York County and the Lancaster Panhandle within that 144,000 acre territory. And suddenly when they go to sell their home, a lot of us just sign those papers, but one of them is about your title insurance. And if you have clear title, the title insurance companies get nervous that there's all these claims that are potentially out there. So at that point, it's no longer just Catawba people saying, hey, an injustice has occurred here. It's everybody within York County clamoring and saying, hey, we now have a problem, which leads us to recognition. But on the flip side of that is that we had to sue everybody that was our friend and neighbor within 144,000 territory. And it wasn't like we were saying, you personally have taken our land, but their land was claimed up. It was part of this claim. And that was the path that the federal courts gave us to do that. And I think you get a lot of that, again, with the state of South Carolina not understanding or being afraid of what it means to have a federally recognized tribe, again, within its borders. So there's an imposition of a lot of restrictions in a settlement agreement. So one of those is that the tribe can offer the same type of gaming that is legal within the state of South Carolina. At that time, you may remember, you couldn't enter into a gas station in the state of South Carolina without there being video poker machines. And eventually, the state of South Carolina decides we don't like these anymore. They go away. If those were legal, we could offer that. Other forms of gaming that they legalized, we can offer within our within our borders. So why do we not have a casino in South Carolina on our lands? Well, it's really two reasons. Number one, it goes back to the termination of the tribe. If the termination of the tribe had never occurred, we would have had the same rights as many other tribes. And probably in the era where there's a Supreme Court case where tribes start challenging and saying gaming is something we think as a sovereign with a tribal sovereignty can offer without regard to the restrictions that the state's placing on us, they start opening up these tribal casinos because it's a form of economic development. They can use that then to provide services to their citizens. So the tribe would have been able to do the same thing on our reservation had it not been for termination. Then on top of that, it's because of the restrictions placed that were agreed to as part of the settlement agreement of the land claim, saying that South Carolina could restrict gaming in the state, and as long as they restricted that type of gaming, we could not offer it. So there's those two reasons why we don't currently have a casino in Rock Hill on our reservation.
I think you once told me that when you go to conferences and you tell people you're Catawba, they go, "Oh, I'm sorry," because of the restrictions that were put on Catawba that other tribes do not have. So this part of the re-recognition agreement was very, very limiting on tribal sovereignty in a way that other federally recognized tribes just don't have. But you did find a workaround.
We did. We did. So there was a lot of legal maneuvering, but we also settled land claims in North Carolina. I think you remember there was a slide that showed our lands weren't just contained to South Carolina. We also had lands in North Carolina, actually all the way up a little bit into Virginia. So even though we agreed to restrictions in South Carolina, we didn't agree to those restrictions in North Carolina. So again, through a very long process with the Department of Interior, we petitioned them for the ability to open a casino just across the border in North Carolina. And it took a long time. It took a lot of memos back and forth of our argument and Interior's response to us. But eventually they agree with us. They see the pathway there, and they see we haven't agreed to the same restrictions in North Carolina that we agreed to in South Carolina, which opens us up to the ability to open up a casino in Kings Mountain, North Carolina, just I think it's 5 miles across the border.
It's been open a year now?
It's actually been 2 years.
2 years. 2
yeah,
years.
2 years.
You did it during the end of COVID, right?
Yeah. Towards as it was starting to wind down, we were able to open.
So you get re-recognized. You have limitations. You're not often, but you have been able to work around some of them. Part of these limitations on sovereignty, obviously they can be problematic, but one of the areas that I don't believe the agreement has any limitations on citizenship. So one of the core attributes of tribal sovereignty is the ability to determine your citizenship, who your members are. And I think, especially in the Southeast, a lot of people have family stories, right, where they have a Native ancestor, they've heard about a Cherokee grandmother, and I guess one of the questions a lot of people may have is, what's the difference, right? Between, does Indian mean genetic? Does it mean something else? Is there a difference between somebody who maybe has this family story and legally someone who is considered Indian?
Yeah, and citizenship is one of the most foundational pieces of tribal sovereignty. You essentially have the ability as a tribe to decide who is part of the tribe and who is not part of the tribe. And there is a distinction, and I think they both have good things about them, right? Just because you can't be a citizen doesn't mean that you shouldn't be proud of heritage and shouldn't join with us and work with us. But citizenship really means that we identify you as someone who is part of us. I often like to remind people we're all citizens of the country right now. Many of us probably in this room are citizens of the United States, and some by birthright, some by immigration, right? It's really no different. For tribes, it's, do you meet the requirements for citizenship? And there can be those who have heritage but don't meet the qualifications for citizenship. And tribes across the country have different requirements. Some of them have stricter requirements. that require a certain blood percentage, which really is based on a colonial system as well. Others have seen that as harmful and don't have that as part of their requirements. Catawba doesn't have that part of their requirements because it's not really about a blood percentage. It's about being a part and having the citizenship and being eligible for citizenship. So for instance, for us, you have to prove a direct descendancy, which means from grandparent to parent to child, from somebody who's part of our base membership rolls where they kept and said, here's who is currently a part of the tribe. So if you descend from people who are part of the tribe, you also are eligible to be part of the tribe. Now, that doesn't mean that you couldn't have had someone who, for whatever reason, life took them away from the area and they weren't counted among those in that membership role at the time. You may still have that heritage, but there is a difference, and it's an important difference. And that doesn't mean that you can't identify heritage. I once was at a conference and they shared with us that one of the things that they found interesting were there are a lot of negative perceptions of Native people at times, but people who have fewer negative perceptions are people who have heritage, right? So we should embrace them, we should include them, and we should include them in the fights for sovereignty, for the fights that we need and we do. But there is an important distinction between being an actual citizen of the tribe and having heritage.
So we're here for the Catawba pottery exhibit.
Mm-hmm.
And Catawba people are known for their exquisite pottery. If you haven't seen it, go see the exhibit after the talk. How have Catawba been able to keep this tradition alive? We've talked about the history, and the history is one of displacement, termination, just everything being thrown at you that, I mean, they expect you to disappear, right? They said that over 100 years ago, 150 years ago, they expected you to disappear. And when you didn't, they tried to make you disappear. You're still here. You're still practicing your traditions and making exquisite, beautiful art. How did that manage to happen?
Yeah, I think as you described that, the history of Catawba is a history of resiliency, of surviving eras of the federal government, the state government, not wanting to deal with us, or dealing with us and then saying we're going to deal with you by pushing you aside or removing you or doing whatever necessary, assimilating your children during the boarding school era, but and expecting us to go extinct. But at each one of those points where it seems like through disease, through federal policy, through all kinds of different things, the Catawba people persist. And it's the same with the pottery. And I think that's really part of the lifeblood and part of one of the major attributes of Catawba. And there's a lot of refinement that goes into Catawba pottery. I'm not a potter myself. I have promised I will learn. There's a lot of, if you have parents who ever give you guilt trips, try a 6,000 year history, unbroken history guilt trip of ancestors telling you, don't be the generation that breaks this, don't be the generation that breaks this tradition. But Catawba pottery, if you haven't got a chance to see the exhibit, it's only Catawba pottery if it's made from the clay that is found on the banks of the Catawba River. So that's the first part. And when you pull it, I have gotten to be part of removing clay. When you remove it, it doesn't look like anything that you're going to see in these beautiful exhibits. It looks like mud. And there's refinement that has to go to prepare it before it can be shaped. Then there's a very specific method that's used to shape it. And then you take often stones from the Catawba River to really burnish it and get it that sheen on it. And then it has to go survive in the fire, that's where it gets its burn. So I think there's a lot of poetry both in the method of our pottery and the survival of our people. You go through lots of steps, there's lots of refinement, but there's resiliency to get to the end of that. And I think that's instructive to us of how we have to keep it alive. So we briefly, I think many of you maybe have heard of the boarding school era, and I think about this a lot because during the boarding school era, our children were taken away and they were assimilated. They were taught not to practice their culture. They had to cut their hair. They had to change their clothes. And there was an aim to that, right? They saw Native cultures. They saw the importance of children. And it was written, it's fascinating, it was written in federal papers that they said the way, the strength of some of these societies is the warmth that they have towards their children. And this is a way to undermine these societies, is take away their children. So when we talk about how are we keeping the tradition alive today, pottery and all of our traditions, it really comes with our children. Teaching the children from the beginning, just as that was the foundation to try to destroy, that's the foundation where you build back up from the beginning. And I think some of the roots of what you're seeing of a resurgence of our pottery tradition comes from that. We have children who attend Head Start, including my own, who attend we have a Head Start program. We have after school programs all the way through elementary, middle, high school. And the goals of those programs are to help children graduate from high school with a plan and with an understanding of what it means to be Catawba. And pottery is a very important part of that. So I think that's really at the core of how we protect and keep the pottery tradition alive, is focusing on the children.
Well, I'm excited to see what the children do next. I know your children are there now, talking about 6,000 years of parental pressure.
Yeah.
Okay, boys, you're next. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to the audience if you have any questions. But I hope you have enjoyed this, and this will deepen your understanding of the exhibit that you've either seen or are going to see afterwards. So thank you all so much for being here. And we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thanks.